Focus today exclusively on the voice onset dimension. There's lots of other things, of course, but to be coherent, this focus. And I'm going to be reviewing results we obtained in research carried out with native Italian learners of English in Canada. The results we have obtained in this research convinced, and other studies have convinced me that input is a far more important determinant of success in L2 speech learning than is the age at which L2 learning began. This conclusion is somewhat controversial, as you know. Many believe that many native versus non-native differences are due to differences in age of L2 learning. AOL is considered important because it is thought to index L2 learners' state of neurological or cognitive development when they began learning the L2. In our research in Ottawa, we selected Italian immigrants based on their age of arrival in Canada from Italy. In our research, AOA is important because it conditioned the kind of experience our participants had with English, defining both the quantity and quality of input that they received over the course of their lives. Now, as you know, the notion of a critical period has been applied to L2 speech learning since 1967, when Eric Lenneberg observed that after about the age of 12, foreign accents cannot be readily overcome, and that the learning process itself seemed to require conscious and labored effort. Lenneberg proposed that for language learning to be fully effective, it had to occur before the closure of a critical period at or around the age of 12. After the stage of development evident at that age, brain functions needed for speech acquisition, according to Lenneberg, may retain some flexibility, but the ability, the underline is mine, the ability for self-organization and adjustment to the physiological demands of verbal behavior quickly declines. With respect to the role of input, Lenneberg suggested that after the closure of a critical period at about the age of 12, L2 learners are no longer able to make automatic use of input from mere exposure to the input. With respect to the use of the VOT dimension and the perception of L2 stop consonants, a recent article in Language and Speech said that L2 speech learning may be especially vulnerable to age of onset effects, which in turn may be related to the early maturation of motor and auditory cortexes of the brain. 20 years after Lenneberg published his famous monograph, I dared to write an article questioning the relevance of the critical period hypothesis for L2 speech learning. I noted that, as formulated, the critical period hypothesis could not be disconfirmed, and so was not a hypothesis in the true sense of the word. Even more importantly, I suggested that enthusiasm for the critical period hypothesis tended to inhibit the search for valid explanations of age-related effects on L2 speech learning, such as input. In fact, relatively little attention has been paid to the role of input in L2 learning. Investigators who accept the critical period hypothesis have tended either to deny the existence of input differences or, more often, to simply ignore them. As I see it, the assumption of that input differences are unlikely to explain differences between individuals and groups of L2 learners has limited progress in the field. As an example, the technology needed to accurately assess both the quantity and quality of L2 input already exists. However, as far as I know, no one has ever exploited this technology in L2 speech research. Okay, our 12-year program of research in Ottawa examined native speakers of Italian who had immigrated to Canada in the 1950s and 60s for economic reasons and had lived there continuously for decades. The first study I'll present was carried out in collaboration with Murray Monroe and Ian Mackay. We selected normal hearing individuals living in Ottawa in a quasi-random manner on the basis of their gender, age, length of residence in Canada, and their age of arrival. We tested our participants in an annex of a Catholic church located in central Ottawa, which had long been the center of the Italian-speaking community in Ottawa. Our first study was carried out in the last 2 months of 1992 and published a couple of years later. It examined 10 groups of 24 Italians each who differed according to their age of arrival in Canada. Here we see how often Italians in the 10 AOA groups reported that English was the better of their two languages. Early learners indicated that English was their better language, whereas late learners usually indicated that it was Italian. However, when we asked our participants which of their two languages they would prefer to keep, if they could keep only one, almost all of them said that it would be English, regardless of AOA. Now, the disparity between the best and preferred language responses reflects linguistic reality. In a later study, we found that Italians living in Ottawa often continue to use Italian with family members and at church events. In most other contexts, for example, going to the barber or hairdresser or talking to a neighbor, they usually reported that they were more likely to use English than Italian. We eventually realized that our participants' age of arrival in Canada conditioned their future experiences with English. For example, most Italians who arrived in Canada before the age of 14 began school immediately and developed lifelong relationships with native English classmates. Most Italians who arrived slightly later in life, on the other hand, went to work immediately. Rather than learning English from native English-speaking classmates, these later arrivals tended to learn English from fellow native Italian immigrants who spoke English with a strong Italian foreign accent. Now, the importance of quality of input can be readily understood by considering the effect of gender on the overall degree of perceived foreign accent. Women who arrived in Canada before the age of about 12, the magical 12 years of age, soon began attending school. They had a significantly better pronunciation of English than did men who had the same AOA and the same opportunity to learn English from native English classmates. However, the women with a mean AOA of 19 years had significantly stronger foreign accent than the men. When the women in this particular AOA group arrived in Canada, they normally worked at home. Their primary model of English was provided by male relatives who were working outside the home. Alas, these men usually brought home with them Italian accented English, and here we see the result. In addition to affecting quality of English input, we discovered that AOA also exerts an important long-term effect on the quantity of English input that is received. Here we see that the Italian self-estimates of percent English, their estimates of percent English and Italian use. Note that participants who arrived as young children reported using English nearly 4 times more than they reported using Italian. Those who arrived as young adults, on the other hand, used English only slightly more than Italian, according to these self-reports. Okay, that's the introduction. Now we'll move to findings, and a lot of these findings are new and have never been seen in public, so bear with me. In the first study I'm going to present was a perception experiment in which we recruited 18 native speakers of English and 190 Italians. The Italians were highly experienced in English, having lived in Ottawa for an average of 40 years. Despite this, virtually all of them spoke English with detectable foreign accents. We assigned the 190 Italians to 10 groups of 19 each based on their age of arrival. The task of the Italians and members of the native English comparison group was to identify members of 4 9-member natural edited VOT continua. The continua ranged from B to P and from D to T. As expected, the Italians consistently labeled the lead VOT endpoints as voiced and the long lag endpoints of the 4 continua as voiceless. We focused instead on how participants identified the 2 short lag stimuli that were found in each one of the 4 continua. We reasoned that the Italians could not establish new phonetic categories for short lag variants of English b-d-g because their Italian p-t-k already occupied this VOT range. Now, given the hypothesis of the SLM that phonetic learning occurs when adequate phonetic input is available, we predicted that our Italian participants would restructure their Italian b-d-g categories. And for details, see the 2001 JASA article. This led to the expectation that the Italians, just like English monolinguals, would identify English stops having both lead and short lag VOT as phonologically voiced, that is, as B or D. Labeling the short lag English stops as P or T, on the other hand, would indicate a lack of speech learning, perhaps due to a diminished capacity for perceptual learning. Now, as expected, the native English speakers identified stimuli having both lead and short lag VOT as voiced. The Italians closely resembled the native English speakers when identifying endpoint stimuli in the continuum, as we had expected. And as predicted, they also closely resembled the native English speakers in labeling as B the 2 stimuli having short lag VOT. This finding supported our category restructuring hypothesis. Responses to the boo-poo continuum also supported the category restructuring hypothesis. The Italians labeled the short lag stimuli as B only slightly less often than the native English speakers did. For the D to T continua, on the other hand, fewer Italians than native English speakers identified the short lag stimuli in an English-like way, that is, as D. So the question we need to answer is, why did some Italian late learners label the short lag English stops in an Italian-like way, that is, as T? Here we see the frequency of Italian-like responses for the native English speakers in the AOA-defined groups of Italians. 6 native Italian groups labeled short lag English D tokens as T, significantly more often than the native English comparison group. 1 Italian group differed for B. Now, the question, like the key question, we're starting to get to some of the key questions. Did differences between the native English speakers and the Italians who arrived in Canada after the age of 12 derived from differing states of neurological development when the native speakers and the Italians first began to learn English? I don't think so. First, consider individual differences in performance. We identified pairs of Italians who had the same AOA in Canada, but differed in their labeling of short lag English stops. Despite having the same AOA, 1 member of each pair of participants identified the short lag English stops in an English-like way, that is, as D, the other in an Italian-like way, as T. Other problems exist for a critical period type explanation. Nearly all of the Italians labeled short lag tokens of English B in an English-like way, and most of them labeled the short lag tokens of D in an English-like way. How could maturational state at the time of immigration decades earlier have affected just some native speakers of Italian for just 1 place of articulation? Also, the results of this study enabled us to reject Lenneberg's 1976 hypothesis that, following the closure of a critical period, L2 learners lose the ability to make effective use of input. As you will recall, each of the 4 VOT continuum had an unedited short lag English stop and a copy from which 5 milliseconds of VOT was digitally removed. Now, if post-critical learners of an L2 are unable to make automatic use of input from mere exposure, we would not expect late learners to distinguish pairs of short lag stops differing by just 5 milliseconds of VOT. However, the Italians were quite sensitive to these small VOT differences. Increasing VOT by 5 milliseconds increased the frequency of their P judgments by 5%, the frequency of their T judgments by 18%. The VOT differences were highly significant in a two-way ANOVA, but did not interact with group. This means that the Italians' ability to make automatic use of VOT input was unrelated to their age of arrival in Canada, and so unrelated to their age of L2 learning. As seen here, there was a strong effect of AOA on amount of input received. Here I've graphed Italian input, but English input is just the flip. Before presenting an analysis of groups defined on the basis of L2 input, however, I first want to describe the technique we use to validate our Italian participants' self-estimated % English use. We asked the 190 native speakers of Italian in our study to indicate if they would be more likely to use English or Italian in 32 different social contexts. In some contexts, most participants indicated being more likely to use English than Italian. Presumably in these contexts, there really wasn't an opportunity to use Italian. For example, buying a refrigerator. It seems from these data that no Italians sell refrigerators in Ottawa, Canada. Fewer Italians indicated being more likely to use English in other social contexts, however, and in still other contexts, most Italians said they would be more likely to use Italian than English. For each participant, we determined the percentage of the 32 contexts in which English was chosen as the more likely of the two languages to be used. The English use and context scores were highly correlated with the Italian self-estimate of percent English use. Here now is the analysis for groups defined on the basis of years of English input. The effective group in this analysis was non-significant for the B to P continua. For the T to D continua, just 5 rather than 6 Italian groups differed significantly from the native English comparison group. We get a slightly better fit to the data for groups defined on the basis of L2 input than AOA. However, an examination of the individual data leads me to doubt that the frequency of Italian-like responses to short lag English stops was determined by input. We compared the performance of pairs of Italian participants who were matched for years of English input, but differed in how often they labeled short lag stops in an English-like way. Regardless of years of English input received, one member of each pair identified the short lag stops in an English-like way, the other in an Italian-like way. Now, having rejected both age of L2 learning and amount of L2 input as explanations for the labeling of short lag stops in this study, the question remains: what accounts for the between-group differences? The answer seems to be differences in bilingual dominance. Now, previous research, which I'm not going to go into here, suggested that our participants' labeling of short lag stops might indeed be influenced by dominance. We asked our native Italian participants to rate their ability to speak, understand, pronounce, and read and write both English and Italian using 7-point scales. Our measure of dominance was the ratio of self-estimated ability in English compared to Italian. On this scale, a value of 1 might be called mixed dominance. Values that were substantially greater than 1 could indicate dominance in English, whereas values substantially less than 1 would indicate dominance in Italian. What determines relative language dominance? In my mind, it's patterns of language use over long periods of time. The earlier in life the Italians had arrived in Canada, the more English input they had received. This is because the earlier arrivals had usually lived longer in Canada and tended to use English more frequently on a daily basis. By the way, we obtained a perfect replication of this when we used the same design to examine Korean immigrants in Washington, D.C. Differences in language use, in turn, led to differences in relative language dominance. Here we see groups of 19 native Italian participants each, defined on the basis of years of English input. The more English input the Italians had received, the higher were their relative dominance scores. Here we see the frequency of English-like D-categorizations of short-lag English stops by groups of 19 Italians each who were defined on the basis of relative dominance rather than age of arrival. The Italians who had become English dominant did not differ significantly from the native English speakers. However, groups consisting of individuals who were not English dominant did differ significantly from the native English speakers. The unusually strong effect of dominance seen in this study was due to 2 factors. First, our native Italian participants, when tested, were in a bilingual mode with both their English and Italian phonetic subsystems activated. Second, the identification test we used tapped a phonemic rather than a phonetic level of processing. Importantly, in the task we devised, there was no correct way for the Italians to label the short-lag stops. The identification task offered a binary choice between phonemes, not a choice between 3 phonetic categories. The CV stimuli were presented in isolation without precursor material that could define the stimuli as being English or Italian. A better testing format, which I outlined in the appendix, would have been a lexical error detection task which yields responses at a phonetic processing level. Had this procedure been used to test the participants in an English language mode, I think that the Italian-like responses we saw earlier would disappear. Of course, more testing is necessary. This would be an easy experiment to do, by the way. So to summarize, the Italians usually labeled both lead and short-lag VOT tokens of English "b" and "d" as phonologically voiced. This demonstrated phonetic learning. About 1/3 of the responses we obtained for short-lag stimuli in the D to T continua, on the other hand, were Italian-like, but this seems to have been due to uncertainty as to what the correct label should have been. The results support the hypothesis that our native Italian participants restructured Italian phonetic categories to accommodate both lead and short-lag phonetic variants of phonologically voiced English stops. The Italians consistently identified long-lag tokens of English B, P, and B, of P and T, even though these stops are realized as short-lag stops in their native language. This does not, however, demonstrate phonetic learning. The reason why not is you saw yesterday. We would expect even Italian monolinguals to do the same, simply as the result of using interlingual identification. Given this uncertainty, I'll now review a study which examined the identification of English stops in a different way. In the 2001 study, we examined the identification of English stops by 72 Italians in Ottawa. As seen here, the early and late learners were subdivided according to amount of continued L1, that is Italian use, high versus low. The stimuli consisted of non-words spoken by 2 English monolinguals. The non-words were formed by inserting tokens of the 6 stops into a AMA frame. The BDG tokens were all produced with short lag VOT. The response alternatives offered on each trial were the 6 shown here. To avoid ceiling effects, the stimuli were embedded in noise. None of the 4 Italian groups differed from the native English speakers in identifying the long lag English PTK tokens. This is consistent with the hypothesis that the Italians had established new phonetic categories for English PTK. For the short lag tokens of BDG, however, the late learners who continued to use Italian often, late high, made significantly more identification errors than the native speakers of English. Here we see the identification errors that were due exclusively to the voicing feature. Once again, it was just late high that differed significantly from the native English comparison group. These results support the hypothesis that the Italians restructured their Italian BDG categories for use in English, but that success in doing so depended on input. Specifically, the unusually high error rate for late high seems to have resulted from insufficient English input. It makes no sense to attribute the difference between the late high group and the native English speakers to age of L2 learning, inasmuch as the late learners who used Italian seldom and had the same AOA did not differ significantly from the native English speakers. Input here seems to be the key. Members of the late high group had received significantly less English input than had members of the 3 other Italian groups. In fact, the input differences were dramatic. Here we see the mean years of English and Italian input that participants in the 4 Italian groups had received over the course of their lives. Members of the late high group had received significantly more Italian English input. There was no difference, or else a difference in the opposite direction for the other 3 Italian groups. So what should we consider to be sufficient input? I proposed yesterday in my tutorial lecture, and it caused a few people to groan, that L2 learners may need as much as 10 years of native speaker input to fully establish phonetic categories for PTK. However, category formation is not possible for English BDG. As we will see later, the question of interest for BDG is not how much, in absolute terms, how much input the Italians have received, but rather what proportion of lead and short lag realizations of BDG they have heard. So far I've been speaking about L2 learning. However, that term is a bit misleading in this context, that is for this population of Italian immigrants in Ottawa. It is impossible to understand the production and perception of phonetic segments in the L2 of bilinguals without first understanding how the phonetic systems of bilinguals are organized. According to the speech learning model, the elements making up bilinguals' 2 phonetic subsystems interact with one another, necessarily, because they exist in a common phonological space. This leads us to expect an influence of L1 segmental production and perception on L2 segments, and vice versa. With respect to bilabial stops, I hypothesized that our bilingual participants in Ottawa had 3 distinct phonetic categories. A restructured Italian B category that they used in both English and Italian, a short lag P category for use in Italian, and a long lag P category for use in English. Before immigrating to Canada, our participants' Italian phonetic system was organized as shown here. In this system, phonologically voiced and voiceless stops are realized with lead and short lag VOT values respectively. As discussed yesterday, when the Italians began learning English, they encountered a phonetic system in which PTK are consistently realized with long lag VOT, whereas BDG are realized with either lead or short lag VOT. As our native Italian participants became bilingual, and I don't know when you pass from being an L2 learner to a bilingual, but it happens, they developed a phonetic subsystem for use when processing speech in an English language mode. As the result of extensive experience in English, the structure of the Italians' English phonetic subsystem came to closely resemble that of English monolinguals, regardless of when they began learning English as a second language. As the result of developing an English phonetic subsystem, their Italian phonetic subsystem, used for processing speech in Italian, underwent change. By hypothesis, the Italian-English bilinguals maintained short-like phonetic categories for Italian potoka, and they used their restructured bodoga categories when processing both Italian and English bodoga. If my reasoning is correct, two things should happen. First, we should observe the production of Italian b with a trace of English, that is, with instances of partial pre-voicing and short-like VOT. Second, we should observe increases in the VOT of Italian potoka. Why? If Italian bodoga are realized with short-lag stops, the VOT of Italian potoka must increase to avoid the production of phonologically voiced and voiceless stops with the same VOT values. Now, in the next section, we'll look at the production of potoka in word initial position by our Italian population in Ottawa. A bit of background. Previous research, not reviewed today, has suggested that the perceived phonetic dissimilarity of English and Italian realizations of potoka is sufficient to permit the formation of new phonetic categories. Nearly all of the Italians in our research had received more than 10 years of native speaker input, and so we expected accurate production by nearly all of them, regardless of AOA. So in our 95, I guess this was speech communication article, we used a delayed repetition test to elicit the production of English words, some of which began with bodoka. Here we see the mean VOT values obtained for 10 AOA-defined groups of 24 Italians each. No native Italian group differed significantly from the native English speakers in producing English K. However, 2 groups of Italians differed for P, and 6 differed for T. These are VOT values that are significantly smaller than those of the native English speakers. So this is not what I was expecting. Moreover, input differences cannot account for these unexpected between-group differences. Here we see the mean VOT values produced by 2 subgroups of 22 each, who were matched for AOA. One subgroup had received more than 10 years of native speaker input, the other subgroup had not. So very specifically, the Italians who had received 25 years of English input, as well as those who had received just 8 years, produced English p and t with significantly shorter VOT values than the native English speakers did. So, in this case, some explanation other than input is needed. And before getting to that explanation, which exists, I must first present, what I need to do is present a second set of data that we obtained for the exact same subjects. In our JASA paper in 95, we obtained VOT measurements for stops found in one of the 5 English sentences that were originally elicited for the purpose of evaluating foreign accent. I'm not going to go into it. Here we see the foreign accent ratings obtained for the sentence of interest, namely, Paul ate carrots and peas. Significantly lower foreign accent ratings were obtained for 7 AOA-defined native Italian groups than for the native speakers of English. We measured VOT in the 3 word initial stops found in the Paul sentence. No native English group differed significantly from the native English speakers for VOT in the 3 stops that were measured. For a closer look, I reassigned the 240 Italians to 3 groups of 80 each. Group AOA 16 to 23 consisted entirely of late learners. This group of 80 Italian late learners did not differ from the native English speakers for any of the stops examined. Variation in speaking rate might in part explain the differing results for stops found in English words and in the false sentence. This is because speaking rate was controlled better in the elicitation of sentences than words. The three Italian groups and the native English speakers produced sentences with virtually identical durations. However, the Italians with a mean AOA of 19 years produced significantly shorter vowels than the native English speakers did. The late learners' shorter vowels indicated a slightly faster speaking rate, which is expected to shorten VOT. However, differences in speaking rate alone can probably not account for the observed differences between late learners and native English speakers in the production of words. I suspect that the difference in English word production between the native English speakers and some Italian late learners was due to code switching by some of the late learners. Now let's return to the word production experiment. We examined the distribution of VOT values that were obtained for early and late learners. Unlike the native English speakers and early learners, some late learners produced English p and t with Italian-like short-like VOT values in English words. So the big question is, as always, why? I hypothesized that some late learners code switched, producing English words with an Italian pronunciation. To evaluate this hypothesis, I identified the 33 Italians who usually realized English p-t with short-like VOT, and 33 others who had exactly the same AOA, but never produced English p and t with Italian-like short-lag VOT values. As expected, the two subgroups of late learners differed significantly for VOT in words, but not for sentences. The two subgroups of 33 each were matched for AOA, and so, not surprisingly, they spoke English with equally strong foreign accents. We can infer that the Italian phonetic subsystems of all 240 Italians in our study were activated when they produced the English words, because they were all tested in a place where they normally spoke Italian, that is, at their parish church. They had responded earlier to a very detailed questionnaire regarding their bilingualism, and they had just heard and reproduced English and Italian sentences in alternation. I hypothesized, however, that some of the late learners were more accustomed to code switching than others, and this is an individual factor for bilinguals. Some code switch, some don't. The 33 late learners who produced English words with Italian-like VOT reported using Italian more than English at home. The reverse held true for the 33 late learners who never produced English p-t with short-lag VOT. I speculate that late learners who often spoke Italian at home were more accustomed to producing English words with an Italian pronunciation, that is, code switching, than those who seldom used Italian at home. The need for speculation might have been avoided had our research carried out in 1992 controlled for both language mode and activation. It did not. To control language mode and activation in the future, researchers should consider using either a repeated measures design or a randomized block design. As discussed in the appendix, both design types have practical advantages as well as disadvantages. Now in this section, we're going to examine the production of b-d-g, which usually gets ignored in L2 studies. I don't know why. Maybe because people just simply haven't known what to make of b-d-g. And we're going to examine production in both English and Italian. Before doing so, we must consider the role of communicative pressure in phonetic subsystem. Sorry, I'm going to have to skip this for time reasons. As discussed yesterday in my tutorial, monolingual English adults produce b-d-g in various ways, with full pre-voicing. Pre-voicing ends prior to stop release or with short lag VOT. I suggested that children who learn English as a native language respond to differences in the input they receive and create either lead or short lag phonetic categories for b-d-g in their native language. Now, by the time our Italian participants got off the boat and began learning English, they had already established lead VOT categories for Italian b-d-g. I hypothesized that as a result of exposure to short lag variants of English b-d-g, they restructured their existing Italian categories to encompass both VOT variants. In 2001, we examined the production of English B by 4 groups of Italian who differed orthogonally in AOA and frequency of Italian use, high versus low. The 72 Italians and the native English speakers produced English words such as bed and bad in isolation after hearing stimulus sentences of the form bad is the next word to sing. We did not measure VOT and B because, given the phonetic structure of English, it makes no sense to do so. Instead, we classified the 20 B tokens that were available for each participant as having been produced with full pre-voicing, partial pre-voicing, or short lag VOT. Earlier we saw that late learners, especially late high, misidentified short lag b-d-g tokens as p-t-k more often than early learners or native English speakers. According to the SLM, the phonetic category representations developed for L2 speech sounds guides the development of phonetic realization rules needed to produce those sounds. This leads us to expect production differences between late high and the other groups. As we see here, all 4 Italian groups produced English B with short lag VOT values. This is something not seen in English, and so this demonstrates phonetic learning. Importantly, however, all 4 Italian groups produced B with short lag VOT values significantly less often than the native English speakers did. Some members of all 4 Italian groups produced B with partial pre-voicing that ended before stop release. This is also something not seen in Italian, and so once again demonstrates phonetic learning. In fact, one group of Italians, the early learners who had a low use of Italian, produced English, and so a high use of English, produced English with partial pre-voicing even more frequently than the native English speakers did. Now, as you know, Italian B is produced with full pre-voicing. None of the Italian bilinguals examined always produced English B with full pre-voicing. However, both groups of late learners did so significantly more often than the native speakers of English. Although the early learners resembled the native English speakers to a greater extent than the late learners, this does not necessarily mean that they had learned English more or better than the late learners. The pattern just seen in production is similar to the pattern we saw earlier for perception. Here we see the relationship between the two. Italian-like identifications of short lag tokens of English b-d-g, that is as p-t-k, implies a reliance on closure voicing as a perceptual cue. The more our Italian participants relied on pre-voicing as a perceptual cue, the more often they produced B with full pre-voicing. I hypothesized that between group differences in both the perception and production of B arose from differences in the relative frequency with which Italians had heard B produced with pre-voicing and short lag VOT. To evaluate this hypothesis, I estimated the percentage of pre-voice tokens of B. The 72 native Italian and 18 native English participants were likely to have heard over the course of their lives. This is a novel approach, and so I will briefly explain how these lifetime language input estimates were obtained. The estimates, simply put, were based on values obtained experimentally and from a detailed language background questionnaire. I'll go through the computation later, time permitting. Here we see estimates of how often the native English speakers and the 4 groups of Italians had heard B, not just English B, but any B, produced with pre-voicing over the course of their lives. The estimated frequency with which members of the 5 groups had heard B produced with pre-voicing captured 80% of the variance in the frequencies with which they produced B with pre-voicing. In another study, we further examined the influence of input on the production of B. As described earlier for stop identification, we recruited 190 Italians in Ottawa who were assigned to 10 groups of 19 each, according to AOA. The mean AOA values for the 10 groups ranged from a low of 8 years to a high of 27 years. The Italians produced alternating blocks of English and Italian materials. The native English speakers, of course, produced only the English materials. We examined the B in the name Barbara, which was the first word in translation equivalent English and Italian sentences. Once again, we used a delayed repetition task. It's a clever task. I'll go into it later if there's time. Crucially, the native produced Barbara stimuli used to elicit production in English and Italian differed phonetically. The 2-syllable English models began with short leg B, Barbara, whereas the 3-syllable Italian models were all produced with lead VOT, Barbara, Barbara. The native English speakers produced the utterance initial English B tokens nearly twice as often with short lag VOT than with pre-voicing. Most Italians showed the opposite pattern, producing significantly more pre-voice than short lag stops. The one exception to this pattern were the Italians having a mean AOA of 8 years. The difference between AOA 8 and the other Italian groups was probably due to input. Here we see mean years of English and Italian input received by members of the various groups. AOA was the only group to have received significantly more English than Italian input. As predicted by the category restructuring hypothesis, the frequency with which the Italians produced English B and Italian B with pre-voicing were strongly correlated. The correlations across languages actually would have probably been a bit higher if without group AOA, who, as we saw, differed substantially from the other groups in terms of input. Using the procedure described earlier, we estimated the percentage of times that members of the 10 AOA-defined Italian groups had heard B produced with pre-voicing over the course of their lives. This analysis replicated the one presented earlier. Here the input estimates captured 82% of the variance in the frequency of pre-voicing in productions of English B. The final study to be presented is that of Flege, and Mackay. For this study, we recruited another 160 Italians in Ottawa, and we assigned them to 4 groups of 40 each, based on AOA. As expected from all of our previous research, the AOA-defined groups differed according to input. The 2 groups of early learners had received more English than Italian input over the course of their lives, whereas the late learners had received less English input than Italian input. We used the same protocol as in our 95 speech communication article to elicit English words beginning with p to k and also b. We had 22 b tokens. Here we see the production data for tokens of English B produced in utterances of the form, now I say boot. As expected for stops in this utterance position, the native English speakers produced B far more often with pre-voicing than with short lag VOT. Of most interest here, however, is the frequency with which English B was produced with partial pre-voicing, that is, with pre-voicing that died out before stop release. something that does not occur in Italian. All four groups of Italians resemble the native speakers of English in producing B with partial pre-voicing. Now let's consider production in Italian. The results for Italian bodega show the unmistakable influence of English. When compared to Italian monolinguals, all four groups of Italian-English bilinguals were found to have produced Italian bodega significantly less often with full pre-voicing and significantly more often with short lag VOT. Here are the mean VOT values obtained for English bodega in this study. These data closely resemble the data that I showed earlier that were obtained using the same protocol. The two groups of late learners produced significantly shorter VOT values than the native English speakers did. Once again, a close look at the data for English PO and TO suggests the possibility of code switching by some late learners. The two groups of late learners, having AOAs of 15 and 20, produced English PO and TO with short lag VOT values significantly more often than either the early learners or the native speakers of English. Here we see the mean VOT values for Italian PO. As predicted, the early learners produced the phonologically voiceless Italian stops PO with significantly longer VOT values than the Italian monolinguals did. In my view, this change in the production of Italian PO was due to phonetic system pressure, not the so-called loss of the native language category. This interpretation was confirmed by a post hoc analysis of the results obtained for subgroups of 18 each. First group were early learners who frequently produced Italian bodega with short lag VOT. The second group, early learners who were matched for AOA, but seldom or never produced English-like short lag VOT values, and finally, Italian monolinguals. As expected, early learners who often produced Italian bodega with English-like short lag VOT values produced Italian PO with VOT values averaging 15 milliseconds longer than both the early learners who seldom or never produced short lag VOT and the Italian monolinguals. The lengthening of VOT in Italian PO is similar to an effect that we saw yesterday, an effect noted for monolinguals in a comparison of two French dialects. And so I suspect that the mechanisms involved in these two cases, language change and L2 learning are the same mechanism. Now, one last finding before I conclude. It's important for our understanding of the ability of late learners to use the input that is available to them. Some, maybe just about everyone, believes that L2 input may be important only or especially in early stages of L2 learning, and that later on, learners make little or no use of input due to what is referred to as fossilization. Our results suggest that this is not so. The VOT data I just presented were obtained in 2003. All 160 Italians in the study had been tested previously in 1992 using the identical protocol. The 92 data for 150 of the Italians and 20 native English speakers were still available, permitting a longitudinal analysis. Now, this finding took my breath away. The foreign accent ratings obtained for 3 sentences spoken by the 150 Italians in 1992 and 2003 were very, very similar. The same held true for ratings obtained for 20 native English speakers, even though their ratings clustered at the high, no foreign accent end of the scale. The VOT values obtained in 92 and 2003 for English PO were also correlated, both for the Italians and the native speakers of English. We nevertheless wondered why somewhat weaker correlations were obtained for the 2 sets of VOT measurements than for the 2 sets of foreign accent ratings. We identified the Italians who showed the largest and the smallest VOT changes over time. For these two subgroups of 20 each, and the remaining 110 Italians, the 92 versus 2003 VOT correlations approximated the near-perfect correlation obtained for the foreign accent ratings. In the ANOVA, we examined the VOT values obtained for the two subgroups at 2 times. The main effective group and time were non-significant. However, the group by time interaction was highly significant. This is because the VOT values obtained for both subgroups changed significantly over time, but in opposite directions. The Italians who produced VOT values averaging 18 milliseconds longer in 2003 as compared to 1992 reported using English significantly more often in 2003 than in 1992. Those who produced VOT values averaging 18 milliseconds shorter in 2003 than in 1992 reported using English somewhat less in 2003 than when they were asked to estimate English use in 1992. Well, let's wrap up. Obviously, there are a lot of pieces. The research reviewed here leads to a number of conclusions that are important for both phonetic theory and practice. Number 1, it's inappropriate to calculate mean VOT values for BDG by averaging over lead and short lag tokens. We've known this for years, and people have avoided doing this for years. Mixing short lag and long lag VOT values for BDG may also be inappropriate in L2 research if doing so makes it impossible to understand what has been learned and what has not been learned. Some learners of English may, of course, produce English BDG with short lag VOT because they haven't learned anything. I mean, this happens, and this happens a lot right at the beginning. But this, I think, is highly unlikely for highly experienced learners. That being the case, it is important to find ways to reduce or even eliminate altogether code switching when variation in language mode is unintended. Theory. Learning to perceive and produce the VOT dimension in an L2 depends more importantly on the phonetic input received than on the age at which L2 learning has begun. For native speakers of English, number 3, for native speakers of Italian, the learning of English BDG and BDG proceed differently due to differing patterns of cross-language differences for phonologically voiced and voiceless stops. Italians who learn English do not establish new phonetic categories for English BDG. Instead, they restructure native language phonetic categories for use both in the L1 Italian and in the L2 English based on the input they've received. Number 5. On the other hand, Italians who receive adequate phonetic input in English do establish new phonetic categories for English BDG. Doing so does not cause them to lose their short lag phonetic categories for Italian BDG. As a result, they have 3 phonetic categories for stop consonants, not 2, as is the case for English and Italian monolinguals. And 7th and finally, Italian-English bilinguals who begin producing Italian BDG with short lag VOT values will increase VOT in Italian BDG in order to avoid producing Italian BDG and BDG with the same short lag VOT values, that is, due to phonetic system pressure. So I thank you for your kind attention and want to remind you that you can download this talk, yesterday's talk, and an extended version of this talk that has data for Portuguese, Spanish, and French from my website. So thank you.